Hey there! A couple years ago, we uploaded a video recapping the current state of the graphics card market, and at the time, it was pretty darn rough. I mean, think about it. This was the start of the pandemic. We had scalpers swooping in because they noticed what little supply was in the market was in high demand, and to make things even worse, that high demand was jacked up even higher on account of surging cryptocurrency prices. It was the perfect storm of events, and for several reasons, which I won't get into here, I highly doubt something like that happens again in the near future. And for you and me, stuck somewhere in between, right? We're not able to get the cards that we want new at MSRP, and we're just not willing to buy in bulk or go straight to distributors and buy 100 of them. What good is that for the average gamer who just wants a single graphics card? We ended up resorting to the used market or straight up just not buying at all, sitting on older hardware for a couple of years. By now though, all of this has changed. Things have more or less flip-flopped. Now we have too much supply and too little demand, which means prices have plummeted, and they have continued to plummet through Q3 2022 as we predicted. Even after AMD and Nvidia, well actually not AMD by the time we're filming this, but after Nvidia has announced 40 series Ada Lovelace architecture, prices for Ampere and older SKUs are continuing to drop, which is a good thing for you and I. It means that now is a better time than ever, at least in recent history, to buy a graphics card. And boy, do I have the data to back this up. Holy cow, we've been monitoring graphics card prices on eBay for well over a year by this point, and this is some exciting stuff. Some really good prices out there. Hopefully this video will point you in the right direction. If you're in the market for a reliable card, mostly used stuff we're going to be talking about here. We will touch on some newer cards as well, or at least new, from a retail perspective, new SKUs. But a lot of the really good value is going to be in the used market. A lot of folks are dumping their older cards because they think they're going to get their hands on 40 series very quickly, or even the leftover Ampere 30, 80s, and 70s that have come down in price as well. So stay tuned. There's a lot to go through, but I think you'll enjoy it.
NZXT's H7 series cases offer plenty of hardware support and a clean aesthetic sure to complement any build. Choose between white or black variants, as well as standard, flow, or elite trims for the right mixture of airflow and beauty. There's plenty of room up top for a fan rad combo larger than just a single 120 or 140, and support for up to a 360mm up front exists for beefy cooling wherever it's needed. You'll also find several fans included depending on the model. If you choose the white one, you'll get white fans, so that's nice. NZXT cases are overall great values, as you'll find, and you can learn more about them by clicking the link below.
I want to kick things off right away with the ways in which we have gathered this data, our methodology, and how it's probably not going to be the same across the board for anyone else who might be doing a similar thing. What we've done is taken advantage of the 3D Mark Time Spy database. You can look up the scores for any graphics card virtually that has been tested in their performance suites, and you can extract those scores and then match those scores up with average sale prices on sites like eBay. What I've done is taken the 10 most recent sales as of time of collecting the data, so at this point it was early October 2022. I type in the name of the card, I rule out cards that are being sold for parts or cards that have water blocks or just issues, weird finicky things. They have to be legit cards that are known to be working, and this is not SKU dependent either. So the higher end cards are going to have probably wider swings in price because there are so many different expensive SKUs out there, but these aren't SKU dependent, so we're just taking the top 10 most recent sales, averaging those prices together from eBay, and then comparing that to the performance of said card, and then it's at that point a very simple ratio, just performance per dollar. You take the score, divide it by the price of the card, and that gives us this column here for value. We took all this data and threw it into scatter plots at different points in time, taken again from April 2021 all the way through to October 2022, around the time we're filming this video. I try to take a measurement once every quarter or so, though it doesn't always add up that way. And this first chart you're going to look at here is for MSRP. So this is separate from the eBay prices I just mentioned. Positioning here is to be expected. Cards like the RTX 3060 Ti, GTX 1650 Super, and RTX 3070 are positioned very highly along the Y-axis, which means they are inherently better value cards. Again, the key is at MSRP. And then cards further to the right are the more powerful cards because the X-axis represents score derived from 3D Mark Time Spy. So you could say that one of the best all-around performers and value-oriented cards on this chart is the RX 6800 XT, because it's positioned very high to the right. But this is where things get a little dicey. Now I'm going to switch the y-axis up from 0 to 30 to 0 to 70, and this is going to make things look a lot more scrunched further down, and you'll see why I did this later on. But this is what we're starting with, right? And you can see that we have a trend line here that kind of shows that more powerful cards, which are the newer cards, typically offer better value. That's the nature of tech. That's what you want to look for. Things totally take a turn, though, when we swap MSRP for ESP, which is the top 10 most recent eBay sale prices for individual SKUs here. Cards like the R9 380X and R9 Fury X are among the best values here by a long shot, mainly because they're very power-hungry cards or very old cards. Actually, both of these are very old cards that just a lot of folks aren't looking for anymore. And when you have so little demand, even in a market that has a ton of it, for older cards, the prices have to drop, right, if you want to sell them. But you'll notice cards like the 1650 Super, the RTX 3070, the RTX 3060 Ti, even the RX 6800 XT, are so far down on this chart that they honestly aren't even worth looking at. For the average consumer, this was very disheartening because it meant that the inherent value of each of these SKUs was basically cut in half. Prices were double, if not triple, what they were at MSRP, which means per dollar spent, you're getting a lot less value. Shifting over to August, you can see things slightly rose across the board. Cards like the R9 Fury X and the R9 380X actually kind of disappeared into the remainder of these SKUs, and I thought that was a bit interesting. Maybe our video had a slight impact there, because there were only a few of those old AMD cards listed on eBay, so maybe some folks scooped them up after they saw it. But I'm not sure how much of an impact, if any, a video like this would have on a market like that. You can see, though, it's still pretty awful. You can't really distinguish cards like the GTX 1080 Ti from the GTX 780 Ti, and that's just not really how it's supposed to be. There were so many constraints on cards like this in the market that it was difficult to really justify any of them over another because they were all so egregiously overpriced. Moving on to March 2022, and again, not much had changed. There was a general shift ever so slightly upward. We still had a negative trend line, although it was rather slight. But there was still no real winners here. Not a single card was anywhere close to a value of 30 on this chart. And that, again, is just indicative of how bad things were around this time. But there was a noteworthy shift between March 2022 and July 2022, and this is where things really got interesting. Across the board, for the most part, very few SKUs were an exception to this. Things like the GT 1030, GT 710, the original Titan, the Radeon 7. I mean, those cards, what very few of them still exist, especially for cards like the Radeon 7 and Titan. They just, at this point, they're almost like vintage cards. You're either buying them to collect them, or you're doing some very specific things with those SKUs in particular that you absolutely need. So those prices never really fluctuated all that much, and even today you'll find that they're still pretty awful values, not that they ever were. But a lot of the mainstream gaming cards out there were suddenly becoming much, much more attainable. Cards like the GTX 980 scoring over a value of 40 on this chart was just unheard of 6 to 12 months ago. The GTX 1070 was suddenly around $200 and maybe $150 again. That's pretty impressive. And even cards like the RX 6800 XT, a very powerful, very new card from AMD, were actually decent buys. I mean, between a value of 30 and 40 on this chart, you're looking at pretty much MSRP for a 6800 XT back in July of this year. And we're going to talk a bit more about these later, but I really think these have already hit kind of like a price floor. I don't think prices for these cards are going to drop any more because they've already plummeted so fast. At this point, AMD is obviously prepping for RDNA 3, so it makes sense to position your cards aggressively from a price standpoint to get rid of what remaining supply exists before the new stuff rolls out. Because once the new stuff rolls out, assuming you don't have supply constraints, the old stuff is just, it's not really going to be worth anywhere near what it used to be. And that's a no-no for retailers and manufacturers. So they're trying to get this stuff out. They're trying to flush it out. It's kind of what Nvidia has already been doing with Ampere as well. But the prices for the AMD stuff really plummeted. And I mean, I get folks all the time on Twitter saying, hey, I bought a 6800 XT or a 6700 XT. I got it for this price. Was it a good price? Almost every price I've seen, I'm like, dang, you got it that cheap? Really? I mean, because in 2021, these cards were $1,000 plus. But they've come a long way. So if you're in the market for an AMD card specifically, they've pretty much already hit rock bottom. If you haven't bought yet, you should probably buy soon, unless you want to wait for RDNA 3. And in fact, it might even be to your advantage to wait for AMD's announcement, for the Radeon announcement, because once that happens, you might get even more of a surge of supply, because folks are going to be panicky, desperate to get rid of them before their cards are irrelevant when the new stuff hits the market. I don't know if any of that made sense. I'm kind of just rambling at this point. Let's jump back into the graphs. So from July 2022 to October 2022, there was again another noteworthy shift. And I think by this point you can see why we had to adjust our y-axis so early on in the game, so that you could see the natural progression of scatter plots over time. We have cards that are well above the 50 value metric. That is pretty darn impressive here in late 2022. Cards again like the R9 380X, and look at that, the GTX 980 Ti, the 6 gig card that competed with the newer GTX 1070, slightly more aggressive on the power draw. That card is nearly a 60 on our value chart, which is, that's crazy for the amount of performance you're getting. Basically what this means is that for the power that this card packs and the price you're paying, this card is almost unbeatable from a performance per dollar metric. Cards like the 5700 XT, 5600 XT, the GTX 1080, they're in the ballpark around 50 or so. At this point, I'd say anything above a 50, especially for a used rig or a value-oriented rig, is an absolute steal. It's such a steal at this point, especially in the 980 Ti's case. Maybe not the 380, because that's even older than the 980 Ti, I'm pretty sure. I'd have to go back and look at that. But the 980 Ti is a more powerful card at that as well. You can see it's almost twice as powerful as a the 380X, according to 3D Mark Time Spy. I might buy a 980 Ti or two if I can find one for around $100 or so. That, to me, that's a steal. Yes, it's an older card. Yes, it runs the risk of basically kicking the can pretty early on in its new life in your rig, but I mean, just clean it up, repaste it, keep it in a well-ventilated environment. I think you could still squeak out a few more years with a card like this. And for the price, it's, I mean, $100? This pretty much rules out, I mean, even RX 570s and 580s are still selling for around $100. Buy a 980 Ti instead if you're willing to go that old. That's my take. Now the much more powerful cards, again, 6800 XT, even the RTX 2080 Ti, the 3080, these are fine. I mean, compared to what we should expect from Loveless and from RDNA 3, I don't think that cards like the 3080 and the 3070, even the especially the 3090, they just haven't, they haven't fully matured in price yet from my perspective here. Because essentially if you notice, what Nvidia's done with their announcement of 40 series stuff is they've kind of juxtaposed Ampere with Ada Lovelace, and they're saying, hey, if you want the biggest and best, buy Ada Lovelace, but if you don't, then we have 3080s, 3070s, and 3060s you can still buy from the previous generation, and they're still great for ray tracing and all that stuff. So they're using this as more or less a tool to get rid of all that extra Ampere supply, which is smart. It's exactly what I would do if I was in their position and I had kind of overestimated the amount of lingering demand after the mining craze had settled down. But I think from a consumer's perspective, this is just another way for us to kind of get back for all the crap that we've gone through. Don't buy these cards if you're willing to wait, if you have any ounce of patience in you, and you want something as powerful as a 3070 or 3080. But you don't want to pay 40 series prices, because we haven't heard anything about the 70. We should have already had the 4070, but they called it a 4080 because Nvidia's Nvidia. We have a video on that already. The 70 series card, the 60 series card, especially the 50 series card, they're not coming anytime soon. In a month or 2 months from now, I wouldn't be surprised if we don't hear anything from Nvidia about those SKUs, because again, we've still got so much Ampere stuff to churn through. So I would use that to my advantage as a consumer, in that you know, in that market for a higher end, older SKU, older architecture model. The 3080, I think the sweet spot for that's going to be somewhere around $500. It's not there yet. Maybe used, you get lucky and you find one for $40 or for $500. But I think for the most part, they're still, let's see, what are they still selling for? Yeah, you've still got several listings on eBay for around $600. And this is too close to MSRP, in my opinion, to make this worth it yet. The older families of cards, again, as far back as even Pascal, they're in the sweet spot because folks that have been holding onto those cards for so long are finally like, oh yes, I can buy an Ampere card at MSRP. Thank the Lord, I'll gladly take a 3080 at $650 or whatever. And so they'll upgrade to the 3080 and then they'll sell off their Maxwell or Pascal card. I see that as a chance for us who have been just wanting something maybe more budget friendly, but didn't want to spend $400 on a 1070, which is what they were costing a year ago. I know that's hard to believe. That's a chance for us to just put together a ton of really sweet budget builds. So take advantage of that. And again, if you're patient, wait even longer for those 3080s and 3070s. I do think there's a bit more room for those to drop. Also bear in mind, by looking at the Steam hardware surveys, the 1060 and the 1650, the RTX 2060, I mean, mainly the 60 series cards here, are still by far the most commonly used graphics cards. Again, this is just one survey, but the trends here really haven't changed all that much. There are no real anomalies for the most part. This is to be expected. So when folks upgrade, a lot of these cards are going to be flushed into eBay, and I think that's just another chance for us to jump on them. So maybe a bit more room for cards like the 2060 to come down in price, but I do think what they're priced at now is already compelling enough. If you're in the market for a card like this and you want ray tracing capabilities, it's pretty hard to pass up a $200 2060. Another visual we can check out is this one here, graphics card values over time. So you have values off on the y-axis and of course time on the X. So starting again when we were measuring this data back in April 2021 when things were absolutely awful, you can see that there's a pretty sharp upturn in value over time. Now you could replace value with price and then you would see the inverse of this, right? Because price is in the denominator in the y-axis, that variable. But if we replace value with price, then the inverse of this trend would occur. You would see a pretty sharp decrease in price the closer we approached October 2022. So again, we can look at cards like the 1070 Ti that have really shot up in value. The GTX 1080 is a card that really shot up in value. And even cards like the R9 380X. You can see the R9 380X is actually a pretty decent value relative to other cards in our chart from around April 2021. But it slowly lost its steam. Around November, it pretty much hit rock bottom in terms of value and then started working its way up again. And then around July 2022, it just shot up. And now you can find these for, again, a value of around 60. That is freaking incredible. I know these cards are very old and they probably don't make sense for a lot of you, but if you are in the market for something that is just bare bones, you just need something to get by, I think this makes a ton of sense for the prices these are going for. Personally, I'd be comfortable going back as far as Pascal to Maxwell. There are, I mean, you're approaching close to end of life on cards like the 980 Ti. I will admit that. Is that going to stop me from using them? No, not for $100. I'll take that risk all day. $100 is a steal for a 980 Ti, I think. But when you're looking at cards like the 1080, even the 2060, even newer than that, right, which is a pretty similar card from a performance standpoint as the 1080. You know, if you can find these for, again, $200 or less, the 1080 you can find now for around $150 if you're lucky on eBay. Those are really good cards that are going to pack a heck of a punch in 1080p, even 1440p. If you go the 2060 route, you're going to get ray tracing capabilities as well. You'll be able to take advantage of DLSS even in some titles, which can help. So there are I think plenty of opportunities out there to build mid to low end systems with pretty sweet value cards. Not so much the higher end stuff just yet. You're pretty much going to be at MSRP, which isn't a bad thing. But if you look at it from a time perspective, these cards have been on the market for 2 years. I mean, the 3080 has been out for 2 years. I know it's hard to believe because for one of those years it was completely unobtainable. But for 2 years, the 3080's been out, and it's just now hitting MSRP. That's another reason why I don't think it's the right time to buy. I think there are more growing pains for Nvidia here. I think they have a bigger price to pay than what they're letting on. Another cool way to visualize how the values of certain cards have changed relative to one another is through this conditional formatting chart. Now I've rotated things 90 degrees just so it fits nicely in a 16:9 aspect. You can see our cards are all listed up top, and there are some models that are just red across the board. Example, GT710, right? Don't buy that for gaming, especially used. I mean, we're paying $50+ for a GT710 used. There's just no hope for you. So please avoid that at all costs. Cards like the Titan RTX, be no surprise. These are still awful values, although they have become better values over time. Relatively speaking, they're still pretty darn awful when looked at in just that snapshot of time that data was gathered. You've seen cards that have rapidly improved. There's cards like the the R9 380X that started really well compared to other cards. You can see it's green there. And then it got a little worse. It kind of blended in, came down to about a 15, and then shot up to a 60. That's pretty awesome. And then there were other cards that were pretty sweet buys at other points in time relative to other things. So like the GTX 1070 Ti, the RX 480, they were really good to buy around March 2022 if you really needed something. Now in October, they kind of blend in, but they're still really good values. I mean, compared to what you would have paid in March, they're almost half the cost, which is pretty awesome. And if we transition from this conditional formatting chart to this one here accounts for all cards at all different times, and so you can see the progression of value increases between each snapshot. So in April, things were pretty rough, right? August, things got a little better. November, it kind of got worse again. I think around the holidays is when things took a turn for the worse. And then March, it improved, but we're still yellow. You know, that's not the Goldilocks zone. Now hold your horses. July, we're getting there. We're starting to see a bit more green. And then October, look at that, so much more green. Do I think by January, February, things are going to be even more green for these SKUs? It's hard to say. Again, I don't have a crystal ball. If I did, I would totally be showing it off right now. But there's probably a little more here to squeak out. What you'll notice though is a lot of the older SKUs are starting to become squished. All the prices are starting to squish together. You notice this especially with cards like the 1060, the 1070, and the 1080. Traditionally, the 1060 has been used around $100 to $150. The 1070 has been around $200, $250, and the 1080 has been around $300. Well, now you can find 1080s for under $200. You can also find 1070s for under $200, and you can sometimes find 1060s for under $100, although they're consistently still found for around $100 or so. So when you get all these different SKUs starting to kind of crunch together, it starts to blur the lines between what really makes sense and what doesn't. Because if a 1080 is now worth $150, does it make sense to pay $100 for a 1060? Well, no. I mean, they should scale roughly the same, right? But you've got that common denominator, right? A price of $0. A card like that's never going to be worth $0. Even broken, it's worth something, right? With the shroud, if the fans work, sometimes you just want to use it as a donor board. So they'll never be worth $0. And so you start to see this kind of compounding, just squish happening with all these older models. And so that's one of the reasons why I don't think that they're going to drop much more in price. It's just because they've already come down so far that you're starting to get that overlap between different layers of cards within the same generation. Pascal especially, Maxwell, it's pretty much already happened. 960s, 970s, and 980s are pretty much all the same price now. So why would you buy a 960 when you could buy a 980 instead? And then it will slowly start to happen, I think, for the ray tracing cards. RTX 2060s, 2070s, and 2080s have a lot more life left in them. So I think we've probably got 2 or 3 years before we start to see that effect happen with 20 series, with Turing. The last thing I want to do in this video is pivot back to the scatter plots for a second. I want to start again with what we've had in April 2021 and just gradually show you the progression of graphics card values over time. Seeing how things have just slowly shifted upward is so encouraging, and it means that gaming PCs are suddenly viable again. And there are so many different things coming out at around October, November, December 2022 that it's just making my head spin, not only in the graphics card space, but also in the CPU game. I mean, not only do we have Intel jumping into the graphics card ring, which is, I think, awesome from a consumer's perspective, whether or not the cards suck or not. They don't look like they suck, but even if they did, the fact that we still have another option in the long run will almost always benefit the end consumer, because it means that Nvidia is not only looking over their left shoulder, they're looking over their right shoulder, and vice versa, right? So I think that's great. That's definitely going to change the game long term. And then CPU side of things as well, AMD duking it out with Intel. It's just, yeah, there's so much going on. I think things are finally starting to normalize again on the distribution side of things, the supply chain side. So only time will tell. But there are certainly many cards out there that I think are worth your consideration, especially used. I would say if you aren't willing to spend $400 or $500 on a graphics card, now's the time to buy. For the most part, there might be one or two exceptions I'm missing here. There's so many SKUs to account for, but for the most part, if you're willing to spend $300, $200, $150 on a graphics card, definitely consider the used market for sure. And I mean, definitely consider buying now. Now is finally the time. If you're in the market for a higher end SKU, if you're patient, wait. If you're not, buy a 3070, buy a 3080. Heck, I mean, I would personally look more toward things like the RX 6800, 6800 XT. I mean, there's always the driver debate and things. Nvidia has the green tax, maybe slightly more stable drivers, but I mean, AMD's come a long way. It's really difficult now. I mean, you just looked at a game, right? It's difficult to determine just from looking at the micro stuttering and things, whether you have an AMD card or an Nvidia card in your system. So I really wouldn't look at it through that lens, although I know folks are going to do it. The blind fanboyism still runs rampant to this day. But the 6800 XT is a really compelling card, even at the price it's at now, new. So that's what I would look for, something like that. But yeah, we'll come back to this again soon. I expect around January, February 2023, we'll have another one of these, and we'll try to point you in the right direction. If you enjoyed this one, let me know by giving it a thumbs up. I'd appreciate it. The comment section is down there if you want to chat it up. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. That's a huge help as well. And I apologize that there's just been so much thrown at you all at once. I haven't scripted any of this. I'm just kind of referencing these charts as I go along with you. But I will have this spreadsheet linked in the video description. If you want to check it out, you can use that to kind of gauge as you're shopping what's good and what's not. If you see a graphics card and you're like, I wonder if that price is decent, well, that's what you can use this spreadsheet for. We made it public in the last video in this little mini series, so I'll make it public again here, and feel free to download it, tweak it, do whatever you want with it. It's open for you guys to use as you please. So again, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next one here on the channel. My name is Greg. Thanks for learning with me.